Sitting right beside me, I have an electroacoustic musician, a master of drone music, if I may say. She tours the world. Do, she tours the world doing ambient performances, and she is also pursuing a doctoral degree at UCLA for musicology.
Yes.
Yes, and her music sounds as if it's coming from the belly of the universe. So,
Thank you.
Sarah, welcome to
Hello.
Amsterdam.
Thank you. Hi.
How are you doing today?
I'm good. I just got off a plane about 5 hours ago.
So all the way from the US?
From LA, yeah.
Okay, so you're feeling fresh,
A little weird,
a little dazed.
but I'm okay.
I got to tell you before I do this interview that this was probably one of the strangest ones I've ever had to prepare for. And that has everything to do with the kind of paralyzing yet calming effect that your music tends to have. So usually what I do is I listen to the music and simultaneously come up with questions. But this time around, I found myself listening to the music and staring aimlessly outside and drifting off, which is a beautiful thing. It's not very productive, but it's meditative. But as you're listening to it, you start to wonder who is the person behind this music. You know, what is driving this person to make these kinds of soundscapes? So, well, I want to start with, let's backtrack a little bit from your past. You grew up in Canada. Tell us a little bit about your musical upbringing.
Yeah, I was raised pretty like traditional piano, classical piano. Did it for like, I don't know, 15 years or something, and then decided I didn't want to be a concert pianist, so I kind of stepped away from that. And then when I was about 20 years old, I just kind of randomly got a job at a musical instrument museum. I just like saw that they were hiring for somebody who like has keyboard skills and likes talking. So yeah, I did that for a long time, and that was kind of the first moment that I was able to be like reconnecting with music in the way that I wanted to, like making music and thinking about music in the way that actually mattered to me, or like what I was hearing or what I wanted to do.
Yeah, because until you got to this museum, you didn't have any contact with electronic instruments or synthesizers, right?
I mean, I was interested in that kind of music. I was listening to a lot of like krautrock and stuff like that, but I knew what the instruments were more or less, but I hadn't had any like actual contact with them or playing them.
Is it possible to get like a bit quieter around us? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. So I was reading in Fact magazine. You have this sort of eureka moment when you're in this museum. So you were playing a long octave on a acoustic organ. Am I right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just a day after experimenting with a Buchla 100 modular system. What was the revelation you had on this day?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I've kind of always thought of organs especially, but just acoustic instruments as being very similar to analog electronic instruments. And yeah, I just remember having this moment when I was playing the Buchla. One of the first things that I was doing was just like taking two. So the way a lot of the Buchla modules, the oscillators were made is they would have two oscillators in one module. And so I would just be using even just a single module and having the two oscillators, trying to get them to stay in tune, not even as like a creative exercise, but just sort of inquisitively testing it out. And I noticed that they would just kind of drift ever so slightly in and out of each other, and that over time it's a very nice sound to have this just kind of shifting frequencies, a very subtle frequency shift. And I noticed that exactly the same thing happens on an organ when you hold down, two notes or whatever, just because of the, physical inaccuracies of the instrument, right? It was built by a human and designed by a human, so it's not going to be perfect. And of course, it's subject to temperature and humidity and all that kind of stuff and age.
Temperature and humidity as well.
Oh yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
On
I
an
mean,
acoustic instrument you're talking about.
on the acoustic instrument,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah. So
But actually, even analog electronic instruments, like the older ones, they can. I mean, the electronics need some time to heat up, to like warm up, to be stable when you first turn them on. So it's the same kind of thing that when you turn on an old synthesizer, it has to sit on for like sometimes even like an hour before it's actually stable enough to be usable.
For real.
Yeah, and if you change, like if you have, a breeze or different lighting or something like that, that can affect the stability of the instrument. So yeah, they're very similar in that way that they're kind of unstable, inherently unstable in their design. And it's not really something that I find with digital instruments, just because, like in the 60s and the 70s, when those synthesizers were the only things that were around, the instabilities were things that people didn't like, right? They were things that they wanted to kind of improve upon. And so in the 80s, they did that with digital technology. It just wasn't a thing that people wanted in the instruments at that time.
Right.
So, yeah.
This for you is like this is a reason why you're choosing willingly to use synthetic synthesizers that are from the 70s.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say among other things, so definitely that acoustic element of them is really important to me. But the other thing that I like about them, and especially instruments from like the late 70s, is that they tend to be musical instruments in the same way that like a piano is a musical instrument or a guitar or whatever. This is why I don't really play modular stuff that much anymore, but like the instruments that are self-contained instruments, that they have limitations and they have a certain character and they have things that you can do with them, but also things that, like I say, they have limitations. And I think that's really interesting in the same way that acoustic instruments do.
With your classical music upbringing in mind, can you talk a little bit about the similarities and differences that you see within the performances that you do today and the classical performance of, say, like a classical piece of piano? Because I think for a lot of people, they'll look at you're performing drone music as something that would be a world away from classical music. But I'm sure that there are actually some things you can pull and take away.
I mean, it really is actually, in a lot of ways, very, very different. I mean, part of the reason why I didn't want to play piano that much anymore when I was a teenager is because I hated performing. And I loved practicing and I loved playing when I was at home. And I loved like digging into certain repertoire, but performing was horrible because there's so much anxiety and there's so much like, it has to be right. And if you make a mistake, that's not good. And you only have the one shot, kind of, that's the view of performance in the classical worlds. And that just did not make any sense to me at all. And so I think even when I started making electronic music, it was sort of the opposite thing, where I was doing a lot of studio stuff and just working on things, that didn't need to be performed, that I didn't care about performing. And then the performing part of it came later, when I realized that like you could be a lot more flexible in that way of performing, and you could take time and you could build up things while you're playing. Yeah. So it for me, there isn't really a lot of similarity, actually.
Well, maybe I was thinking more about, say we're talking about Baroque, like classical music, this idea of releasing tension. So maybe in terms of the theory that you're using in the music, maybe not the rules, but the theory itself.
Yeah. I'd say that like the structure of the music that I liked playing, the classical music that I liked playing, like Baroque music and stuff like that, it's very similar in like, the approach, I guess, when you're performing the kind of music, or when I'm performing the kind of music that I make now. It's a similar kind of like mind space that you get into, just sort of getting lost in something. Yeah.
Your music, in a very real sense of the word, has a feeling of divinity, of holiness to it, if I may say.
Thanks.
Because you use the organ frequently. You have these long, sprawling harmonics, and then even recently you had some rather ghostly vocals on Pale Bloom, your latest album. So before we dive into this topic a little bit further, I would love to like play the audience a snippet of this sound that you have.
Sure.
So this comes off your second track off Pale Bloom.
Uh-huh.
Um, and suddenly the mood changes. It shifts a
I get
bit.
very uncomfortable listening to my own.
Yeah,
music.
I could kind of tell. Well,
Yeah.
I'm sorry I put you
That's
through
okay.
that.
I'm used to it now.
You're used to it, okay, at this
Yeah.
point. Um, that is what I'm talking about, though. There's this like sense of, yeah, I don't know, holiness. So I wanted to ask you, what drives you to make these almost service-like compositions?
Um, I don't know. I guess I've always kind of been attracted to music that feels more like intimate or more like you have to kind of dig into it a little bit, or music that just kind of makes you turn your brain off in one way and turn it on in another way. Um, but I think mostly, I don't know. I find that kind of sound just like aesthetically very appealing. I mean, I'm an atheist. I didn't grow up religious at all, anything like that. I really love going to churches. Anybody who follows my Instagram knows that. I always am like, oh, I'm in a city. I'm going to go to a cathedral. Uh, and I like those kinds of spaces. I like them again aesthetically, but I also just like the stillness of them, and I've always kind of been interested in that.
What is it about the kind of, because there's also an acoustic element to a church.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I mean, that part of it, oddly, I don't experience as much. I mean, when I'm in a church and just visiting or whatever, they're usually I'm usually not attending services or anything like that, so it's usually just a visual kind of just being in the space. And when I'm playing in churches, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to appreciate the space itself or the way that the sound is happening in the space, because often I'm playing the organ. And when you're sitting in front of an organ, again, it's an acoustic instrument, so the sound is right there, so you're not hearing it like everybody else is hearing it in the rest of the church. So that always feels to me a little bit separated from that experience.
okay.
But I can sort of project it, and I play to that idea of what it would sound like for
Because
the
when
audience.
you're playing in a church, are you usually using only an acoustic instrument?
It depends. It depends usually on like time and what the people who are putting on. Some people request specifically they want organ and an electronic component, and some spaces are a little bit more suited just for the organ, especially
Yeah.
like smaller churches
Yeah.
tend to work better in that way.
I can imagine it sounds quite amazing in a church just because of these extremely high ceilings like we have up in here, where you don't necessarily know where the sound is coming from.
Yeah,
You know,
it's a really different kind of experience, and it's interesting. I've sort of thought about it a bit, especially with like the music that I do for records tends to be very like sounds are placed in a very specific way,
yeah.
and that kind of thing doesn't really work very well in churches because the sound just gets diffused beyond control sometimes. So it's the same kind of sound, but it is experienced a little bit differently,
Yeah.
I think, which is interesting.
It sounds like a church-like music, although it won't work if you play it in a church. Is that almost the?
Yeah, it's a funny like oxymoron kind of experience or something. Yeah.
Okay. According to your website, Um, your music is primarily concerned with disclosing the psychoacoustic elements of intimate oral spaces. And by psychoacoustics, we're talking about the scientific study of sound perception and the psychological responses that you have to sound. If you will, as a researcher and as a musician yourself, can you tell us how you see the relationship between sound and space?
Yeah, I mean, for me, so with psychoacoustics, there's a lot of different ways that the sound can sort of resonate in a space and then sort of be perceived in a particular way. But there are only certain aspects of it that I like to hone in on in my own music. And one of the things that I find myself really interested in is just this idea of building up like overtones and just building up sort of vertical structures or harmonies within a sound experience. And when you're in a specific space, like in a recorded space, you kind of have to artificially create that sense of, depth or structure. But it's always interesting to me when I play live that you can kind of depend on the acoustic space in a way that you can't in the recorded world. And it's also interesting that you can also, there's so much control that you can have in a record that gets completely taken away from you in a live aspect, which is really interesting. And it's almost like I often think of like physical space as like this choose your own adventure kind of listening environment, because depending on where you're sitting or how you're sitting or, how even your head is oriented, that can change things. And so I think that's kind of an interesting like split between sort of the public experience and the personal experience in a live setting that you don't really get as much in a record.
Right.
I think.
Because I can imagine if you're going into a space, say you have a performance tonight. Actually, this is just a question in general for you. If you're going into a space and you have a performance to do you scope out the space beforehand, or do you have an idea in mind before and just simply play that? Does the space have an effect on the performance that you eventually perform?
It does when I play in churches. That's definitely something. I spend time in churches before I even start working on the piece. Because oftentimes, like you might have different parts of the organ in different parts of the church, and just the way that the space is set up, you can kind of imagine where people will be sitting or if they might be walking around. Also, that can affect things. In more sort of like traditional venues, it can be a little bit harder to do that. I don't even bother doing it when I play in like bars or whatever, because I know the sound is it's going to be what it is. But in a space like this, yeah, I mean, I kind of do it during the sound check. Like I'll often, make a point of walking around and especially going into different spaces and just kind of, thinking about things that I can tweak to kind of make it a little bit more in my control of what I want people to hear. But yeah, to a point, you can only do that to a point. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of, it's out of your hands in a very interesting
Have you ever
way.
walked into a space and just been like, yeah, this is not it? Like,
Oh, of course.
yeah.
Not lately, thankfully.
Not lately.
Yeah,
You've reached the point where you can avoid this.
I think I've reached a good point where I can. I don't play in bars as much as I used to. I've maybe crossed that bridge.
No.
But I still do. I mean, especially in Europe is very lucky to have so many beautiful spaces and a community that respects music being presented in appropriate spaces. That unfortunately that infrastructure is not quite there, at least in the US. I find it's a lot harder to find there.
Coming from Oakland, California myself, I'm aware.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why I moved here.
It's tricky. It's really tricky in the US. So you have to go with the flow a little bit more when you're playing shows there. But I've also been really lucky in the shows that I have played in North America. I've played. There are a lot of really exceptional venues there that I've been able to play.
Besides being an artist, a composer, traveling, this whole shebang, you're also pursuing a doctoral degree at UCLA.
Trying to. It's hard.
I can imagine it's hard because you're researching, amongst other things, experimentalism, the aesthetic phenomenology of instruments and timbre in different realms of music.
Yeah.
All right, so that's a mouthful.
That's a lot.
But based upon your research and your work as an artist, can you talk a little bit about how you go about pairing different sounds, different instruments, in order to get the texture you're looking for in a track? So, seeing like I thought about this because you're studying experimentalism as well. Is this an experimental process of seeing what instruments go together to get that texture, or yeah, how do you go about that actually?
Never really thought about it. Never really thought if there was like a process that I follow. I guess I tend to gravitate towards certain types of instruments, like instruments that have a really rich quality to them, which is why organs and synthesizers and string instruments are really interesting to me. But even within that divide, like I've been doing a lot of work with early string instruments like gambas lately.
Like what?
Viola da gamba. There's actually on this record that just came out. There's it's like an early version. The gamba family is like the early version of the violin family. It's like the Renaissance
So it
version.
predates the violin.
Yeah. It's like the early version of it. And the shape of the body is a little bit different, and the way that it's played is different. But one of the main differences is that early string instruments use gut strings, which have a very different sound quality to them. So just more like specific things like that. But I don't know. I guess I've kind of opened up a lot more. I think I'm just kind of interested. Like maybe in the earlier days, it would be more like this is the kind of texture I want, and I'm going to go look for the instrument that'll get me that. And now it's a little bit more like I look at specific instruments and I think like, how can I get something that I like out of this? So yeah, I think it's more instrument. Like I feel like I could kind of sit at any instrument and find something that I find appealing in
Right.
it.
Because I wonder this, because these are really intense pieces, and I know that this isn't something that just it is something that probably just kind of comes about. You can't necessarily pre-plan everything, or do you ever have a moment when you're outside the studio and you realize exactly what you want?
Yes,
Okay,
in the middle of the night.
In the middle
always.
of the night.
Always.
Always in the middle of the night.
I was just talking to a friend about this like a few hours ago, that my brain is like active at night and it's completely useless during the day, for the most part. Yeah, Dan.
We should have had a midnight interview.
Well, technically, for my body, this is like what, 6 o'clock in the morning. So I don't know. So I don't even know anymore. But we were just talking about this earlier, that for some people, it's just in the middle of the night, things click, you know?
But
And so I often, like, if I get up in the middle of the night, for whatever reason, I have a hard time falling asleep again because my brain is just going.
It's rattled. But then is it like, okay, middle of the night, I got something, I'm going to run to my organ in the hallway or wherever you have it.
I keep a notebook next to my bed.
You have a notebook.
Yeah.
Then,
or like my phone.
Okay, and keep a kind of an idea of what instruments or feeling you're going towards.
Yeah, and it's not something that's like super specific that I'm gonna wake up and forget it. It's usually like, oh, I should try this, and then I wake up and just do it. And, yeah. I don't know.
Not too long ago, or in the last few years, you've started to have visual artists interpret your work and perform alongside you. What is it like to have your work, or seeing your work interpreted in a visual manner?
It's interesting. I don't do it that often. I'm pretty like picky about the times that I do it. And I think that comes from early days of like just having somebody throw some random visual onto the music, and that tends to, I don't know, I just feel like that sometimes is doing a disservice to the listener, kind of assuming that they need something to look at. So when I do it, I'm pretty specific about the circumstances. It needs to be like the right setup, the right presentation, and who I do it with. And I don't think I've ever had an instance where I've done a visual thing without like knowing the person at all, or like having talked to them. I think there was one time I played in Portugal last year, and I did a collaboration with a visual artist. But even then, we were like talking about it through email and stuff months prior. But everybody else I've worked with doing visuals is either like, I mean, they've always been like good friends, like people who understand my music, who I've been able to like work through the whole thing back and forth with them. Yeah, for me, that's kind of the way that makes sense to do it, to actually be able to like have it be a dialogue and have it be a symbiotic thing.
Before we close this thing down, a lot of us here are in for a long weekend of music listening, and we have a crazy mixed bag of artists that are going to be here. So you yourself, as a careful researcher of UCLA and of music in general, do you have any advice for us for how to listen to music in a more profound way?
I would say take breaks from music. Like, I think it's nice to. I mean, I've been doing this. Like I've been going for walks a lot, or even like when I'm in an airport or something, like traveling and stuff like that. I almost always have headphones in. I'm always listening to music. But lately, I've just been trying to like take it away and just kind of be in the space, and I think it serves a dual purpose of like kind of letting your brain and your ears cleanse a little bit, so that when you come back to listening to something, you can actually listen to it as opposed to just having it come at you. And I think it's also useful to like just listen to space and kind of get a sense for the way. I mean, that's a super interesting sound. We should put a mic on that right now. I don't know, you know what I mean? It's just like to get a sense of things that happen around you, and the way that sound just kind of naturally happens.
So maybe we can find a place at Dekmantel that's like the silent zone. Or yeah. Maybe a sensory deprivator.
I don't know if that. I think maybe that's too extreme. I don't know if you could like go crazy, being able to hear your heartbeat, or that might be too intense.
Maybe
but just just taking a break from things, letting your ears rest, is very important, I think.
Sarah,
yes.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming here and talking to us about psychoacoustics. Everybody, please give it up for Sarah, please.
Thank you. My little crew right there.
Yeah, we got a crew.
They're playing soon at 8 o'clock.
8 o'clock.
Right?
8 o'clock. Okay. All right. Well, next up we got BK Owusu, my man over here. All right, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.